Welcome to Subscription Prescription, the podcast where you get the information you need to scale your subscription program. Hello and welcome to another dose of Subscription Prescription, the podcast where we help you figure out everything related to D2C subscriptions. This week's episode, we're going to be talking a lot about content. But before I jump into this week's dose, I want to take a quick moment and give a shout out to a special partner we have at Subscription Prescription, and that's Penmo. For those of you that are looking for opportunities to create more content, whether that's a newsletter, blog, articles, social posts, you name it, Penmo is your go-to spot for content creation. Now, as opposed to most platforms that are touting the power of AI and having AI create content for you, Penmo is actually a platform that connects you with real live writers across the world that are experts in their craft. And the best thing is it's scalable. The price is incredibly affordable with plans under $500. And with a special that we have running right now for Subscription Prescription listeners, you can get 20% off your first month's fee and get your first article ready for you to review in under a week. So if you're looking for a great way to scale your content, go to penmo.co today and don't forget code MATT20 as a promotion code at checkout. Okay, content. Now, content is a really broad topic, and I'm going to do something a little bit different on this week's episode. I'm actually going to break down the fourth wall a little bit, and if you'll excuse me alluding to my theater background, fourth wall is kind of like giving you a look inside how the soup is made, so to speak. And part of that is because I know that so many of you out there fall into one of these few categories, that you're either a founder trying to get your business off the ground, you are working for an agency, a service provider, where you're similarly trying to get your services or your company off the ground, or you're working for software and doing the same thing. All of these different types of businesses are listeners and are part of the Subscription Prescription audience trying to figure out subscriptions. And all of us are trying to figure out how to do better at content. So I thought it'd be an interesting dose to talk a little bit more about my approach, my strategies, and my tips for creating content. So if you're trying to create content or you are a content creator already, stay tuned. That's what we're going to dive into today. Okay. So the first things first, just going over some basics about why content is so important. Now, it used to be back in the day, you could just call somebody up and sell them something, right? I mean, that's not really true. If we look back at like in the 50s, direct mail, long form advertisements in newspapers, content and copy have existed for a very long time. And now with the advent of social media platforms, Instagram, TikTok, Snapchat, Threads, I'm sure there are many more to come, content is everywhere. We all spend time doing that, consuming that, and content is incredibly important if you're trying to cut through the noise and reach your target consumers, right? So content is incredibly important. And content exists in a lot of different formats. So while that's a really broad term, I'm going to try to be as specific as possible when I talk about it for you. So for those of you that are working on the e-commerce side, this applies very much in a similar fashion because you're trying to get out there and tell your story or get people to buy your product. So I'm going to focus a little bit less on the type of content you would normally maybe put into an ad or an ad format and focus more on content that we look at from an organic standpoint. Something you're posting on LinkedIn, Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, the list goes on and on. Okay. And when we're talking about content, there are a few different forms of content that we're talking about. We have written posts or static posts, videos, blog articles, newsletters. There's a whole lot of them. But as I'm making this sound more and more complex, that's actually the great point of where I want to kind of take a step back. And I'm going to talk to you with examples of brands that I know, but also use Subscription Prescription as a really, really good example. So Subscription Prescription, for those of you that don't know, actually started my business partner at QPilot, which is a subscription app platform. We started Subscription Prescription because we were looking to expand our content reach and get people that were interested potentially in looking at our software, right? That was the initial thesis behind why we created it as a newsletter. But as the newsletter started to scale and we were acquiring people and talking to people that were subscribing in the newsletter, we got a lot of feedback that people were just looking for help on subscriptions. They weren't really interested in switching software. Okay, interesting. So we used that as a feedback point and pivoted part of our business into creating Subscription Prescription as a media entity, as a consulting arm. And fast forward to, I'd say 2.5 years later is kind of where we're at today. So the newsletter started as an opportunity to talk to people about problems with subscriptions. And the nice thing when we're talking about content, a concept that I got from a really good friend of mine, Nick Staggy at the Grounded Company, is he explained it to me years ago using a cookie analogy. So if you think about content as a cookie, you can have a really one big piece of content. That can be like a newsletter. It can be a really massive white paper that you've written, a really big ebook, something like that. That cookie can exist as its large cookie self, but you could also then break off pieces of that cookie as cookie crumbs and create additional pieces of content. So as an example for Subscription Prescription, one of the things that we really like to do when we're creating content is I'll do a newsletter issue and a podcast episode that are both the same thing. We've kind of transformed that the podcast drives the newsletter from a content perspective. So I will film this podcast. I will use the transcript from this podcast to create notes that I use to write a newsletter. And I use notes to create the podcast in the first place, but that's not always quite the same thing. So we create a podcast. The podcast makes it really, really easy to create a newsletter. Out of that newsletter, I will pull different points or ideas and create social posts that I create to put on LinkedIn and Twitter. Okay. So again, when I started out talking about all the different platforms and everything you can do and go on those things, it feels really, really overwhelming. But if you think about a very linear progression from podcast creation to newsletter creation to social posts for those platforms, it actually becomes a lot simpler and a lot easier to manage. So for your brand, you can think about the same way, and you can start in a lot of different places. If you're thinking about something that you're really, really good at, right? Are you a writer? Are you good on camera? Or if it's really just you're good at talking about what you're passionate about, I think is still a great place to start. You can think about creating content like long form video. You can create a long YouTube video that you could then clip up into smaller pieces to put onto YouTube Shorts and TikTok and other video platforms, right? Like Instagram Reels. If you're creating an ebook, like if you're trying to solve a really sophisticated problem, you might create a really in-depth guide to how to tackle this, right? That's a lot of effort, but it's something you could complete over the course of several months, working at nights, weekends, or even as part of your day job of creating that ebook. And then that ebook can become something you can splice up into smaller pieces and share out and tease it, whether it's a chapter or a snippet, right? So I want you to be thinking about kind of like, what content piece can I create that can be impactful for my business? Now, that's talking about content types. But when we're thinking about content, I also want to, again, taking a step back and instead of worrying so much about the content being perfect, I want you to think about TikTok, Instagram, some of these other platforms where you have viral creators that are making content that seems like they're just talking to you like I am right now. Now, there's a lot of tips and tricks to making the content more engaging, more grabbing, talking about call to actions and all kinds of things. But for now, if you're just getting started on the content side of things, I want you to actually just get in the habit of creating content, right? So I found success on LinkedIn initially just through consistently posting and gauging how I was getting reactions and then diving deeper into things that were resonating well. And then also when there were topics that I wanted to talk more about, but didn't get a lot of engagement, I kept playing with formats to get those. And so I went from 0 to now over 10,000 followers on LinkedIn just through following that process of creating content, but also reaching out and connecting with people. And when I meet a lot of brand founders, a lot of agency founders, a lot of SaaS founders, one of the most compelling pieces of content out there that I sincerely say is not created enough is your founder story. What caused you to start the business you've started today? Now, for those of you, it might just be something as simple as, hey, I needed to make more money, so I thought this would be a great way to do that. And I'm sure that's true. But for most of us, there's some other compelling piece of that, right? Like we interviewed Lisa Mastella, the founder of Bump and Blends, a few months ago. And she was a dietitian and talked about her love for smoothies and their health benefits. And she shared how she was actually pregnant and had a little bit more time because she was off work that way, but also kind of decided, hey, I'm going to take a stab at this idea. I think I can do smoothies a little bit differently and care deeply about trying to solve like health and accessibility to like healthy ingredients for a lot of people that she knew and potentially for like the entire world, which is why she launched Bump and Blends, right? So talking about that as a story is content, okay? And the other piece of content that when we're talking about thinking about how to create something that's going to be compelling or useful or interesting is using stories, okay? Like, for example, if I'm just talking about how if you're a founder, you need to go out there and tell your story, that's maybe it's okay, compelling. But I use the Lisa Mastella example because that's an actual story of a real person who's done a real thing that you can relate to, that you can go look up and read more about, that you can be interested by, whether you're talking about a married mom starting a business while she was pregnant, a dietitian wanted to create smoothies, or just somebody creating a smoothie business, right? Those are different attributes of that story that are compelling to you. So when you're thinking about the type of content you can create, a lot of times it's that story, it's that founder's journey, it's that I saw a problem, or I kept seeing my friends struggling with this, or my child suffers from this and I wanted to solve that. When it comes down to that type of storytelling, that is truly compelling content. You think about some of the best and brightest e-commerce brands out there. That's what they're doing, whether they're talking about fresh pet food and about how they're trying to save their favorite golden retriever, where they were talking about how they used to suffer from stress and anxiety, so they launched a CBD company. It is across the board one of the most compelling ways to create content. Even if you're on the agency and SaaS side, you can do some of that similar things. The difference is on the agency and SaaS side, while the founder story stuff can also work for you, it can be even more compelling to try to tell the story of your customers, right? Because while if you're selling email marketing, for example, as an agency, while everybody might not relate to your story of working at a brand and being frustrated, so you went to start your own agency, a lot of people will be able to relate to how a customer or one of your clients was struggling with emails and wasn't really working. And so they paired with the right partner and were able to make some discoveries and implement these things and saw great successes, right? We call those in the content game, we call those like use cases or case studies. But similarly, they're just really just a story with some kind of outcome attached. Now, getting to some tips and tricks that I want you to think about from a content standpoint. This is actually, I'm going to start with like the least sexy tip of all, but it's really, honestly, it's about consistency. Okay. And I would say it's more important to get started than it is to get started right. But once you get some consistency going, that's when you want to start incorporating insights from experts, right? So as an example, if you're writing articles and posting them as blogs, getting the habit of writing is the first step and is the most important step. But once you're going, you're going to want to bring in an SEO expert or somebody who's an expert at writing blogs to help give you some advice, some guidance, maybe a paid consultant to help guide some of that strategy. So you can make sure you're not making any dumb mistakes when it comes to getting your content to rank organically with Google, as an example. Video is another great example. If you're making videos every day on TikTok, you're getting that, but you're stuck at that 200 view per video threshold that a lot of us reach, then you reach out to other content creators about how to break through that, how to get more advice. But you can't get advice. The expertise that you would need for that is not going to work for you unless you're in the habit of creating content, right? So when I first started this podcast, I launched it with an amazing company here in Salt Lake called LaunchPod Media. They gave me tons of insight and advice. But one of the things that they told me right away was it's really not until you get at least 10 or 15 or even 20 episodes in where we're going to have enough information to start figuring out what you should be doing better, right? So the same thing applies for all the content you're creating. It's about showing up. It's about being consistent. It's about taking some risks as well as being a little bit uncomfortable, putting yourself out there. And then once you have that consistency, you can start reaching out to other people that are a little bit farther ahead of you on that journey to figure out more about what they do. If you're a founder, talking to other founders about their content, talking to video creators, and getting a lot of insight and expertise from there. And as for me, as a resource for any of you who are listening or watching this, and if we aren't connected on LinkedIn or Twitter, please look me up or feel free to email me at matt@thesubscriptiondoc.com. I would be more than happy to provide you with my own 2 cents or insight. I love to support other content creators because I am one myself. Thinking about additional insights or expertise is there's a lot of different ways to frame content. So once you've got content going, you can frame content in a different way. And this is what I mean. If I were to tell you that, well, I guess we can pick on email marketing since I mentioned them already, is if I were to I could create an advice about the best way to do email marketing for subscriptions. That might get some views. But one of the things that's really, really compelling is actually um, what I would call like leaning into pain points, or like it's like scratching at a scab, if you'll forgive that really gross like visualization. Instead of saying like, hey, here's the best blueprint for email marketing for subscriptions, you might lead with, hey, most email marketers do subscriptions wrong, and this is why. Boom, boom, boom. Right. So there's a lot of different frameworks for here. And so I also want to spend some time mentioning some experts and people that I follow, but that's a framework of a pain agitation solution framework, or the pause framework. Essentially, you're mentioning a pain point, you're doubling down on how painful that is, and then you're providing a solution. So there's a lot of different ways you can play with content to try to get outcomes from people. But again, I would focus on sharing your expertise. Being genuine in those things is always a great place to start. Stories about how you've solved something, why you're there, why you're doing what you're doing. Stories about your customers or clients and how they have solved things and fixed things, and how you have been a small part of that, as well as looking into how you can use pain or agitation as a means of like getting a little bit more insight, cutting through the noise on social, but also making a point about how you think a solution should look. Circling back to this cookie idea, I want to share this an insight of something that I'm seeing across the board, especially on the e-commerce space. So we're seeing a lot of really amazing guides coming out. Lots of different people partnering together to create the go-to CRO handbook for e-commerce stores, the go-to subscription handbook for e-commerce stores. You're seeing a lot of big collaborations, or just really big pieces of content. Like, here's my I mean, I've done this before where I did like 100 different ad examples from subscription brands in the past. The fun thing about that is it feels like you're giving an immense amount of value for people, right? You're overwhelming them with templates, with ideas and things like that. And again, as I mentioned with this cookie idea, that gives you an opportunity to pull out tons and tons of examples. But I would qualify it to say that you don't just start out with that kind of stuff. If you're not already making smaller pieces of content in some way, shape, or form, then that big piece of content is going to feel really, really overwhelming. In reality, you want to start creating those small bits of content so you can get feedback on what you should be creating. So for example, earlier, I think about a week or two before this episode gets released, we'll have an episode on email marketing. And I'm doing a dedicated episode on email marketing because I've been getting lots and lots of questions and inquiries from people about emails. So once you have content out there, you start to get feedback from people with questions about how they solve something. If you're a brand founder talking about fresh pet food and you start to get questions around how you store that food, okay, well, how you store fresh pet food is now a content opportunity, whether it's a video, an article, or something like that. So it creates this, it's a cyclical process. You get started, you look at optimizing it, improving it, you get feedback from people, whether that's direct feedback or just see what type of videos that get watched, or what type of content gets interacted with, what types of downloads or clicks you get from ebooks and things like that. And you go back to doing that over and over and over again. Now, as I wrap up, I do want to mention some of the resources that I use and have used in the past when it comes to being a better content creator, marketer in general. I do want to give a big shout out to, from a B2B marketing side, Dave Gerhardt. He's the founder of the Exit 5 marketing community. He's been at a few different companies in the past leading marketing. He's one of my favorite people because he's just so practical, hands-on. I remember a discussion we had in a Facebook group. I was partially criticizing, partially questioning this really, really long headline he had on a website of his company, because it's very much like not what you get trained in B2B marketing school, so to speak. And his retort was, well, it works. We tested a lot of stuff. It works. So that's what we're keeping. I was like, okay, well, that's actually about as practical as you need to be. We've been testing stuff. This is what works the best. So Dave Gerhardt, you can look up Exit 5 community, specifically for B2B marketing and B2B content. He's amazing. Another person out there I think that applies to just about anybody is Justin Welsh. He's massive on LinkedIn and Twitter. He actually has some paid frameworks you can buy about creating content, scaling content, using your newsletter, turning that newsletter into micro posts, how you put those across social. I've bought and used and read a lot of that stuff. I actually have templates of his that I use on some of my social posts. He is absolutely amazing and absolutely worth every dollar that you can spend on his content if you're using it, right? If you're using it. Another bit of content piece is the story brand. This is a book you can buy. It's actually also like a marketing method. You can find agencies that specialize and that have been certified in this method. The story brand is essentially a framework with a worksheet, template, all this stuff included in the book, where it teaches you how to talk about what you do in terms of the person who would actually be using your solution. So the classic example, they use it in StoryBrand. I learned it this when I was in high school. It's the hero's journey. So if you think about yourself when you're positioning your content, think about how you're Yoda in the Star Wars movies franchise, or you're that really sage friend that gives really good advice, but you're not the main character. So if you think about it, we all go to the movie to see Luke overcome good and evil, all that stuff, right? In the Star Wars franchise and all those other characters, right? Yoda is part of that, but Yoda is just helping Luke on that journey. And when we're marketing, if we only talk about ourselves too much, then we run this risk of like alienating people. Like you just keep talking about what you do, what you do, what you do. That doesn't speak to me. The story brand helps you get in the shoes of your end user. So like for me, when I talk about subscription marketing, when I'm marketing to people that might want to use my services or opt into my newsletter, I'm often trying to share from their perspective how something can be helpful for them. So it's not about this is what I do all the time. It's more like, hey, brand founders that are looking for a better email marketing solution for subscriptions, this is what you this is a great thing that you can use for that, right? So it's really all about putting yourself in their, putting them in the spotlight, and you're just a guide or supporting that. So I highly recommend that. The other thing would be looking at the copywriting resources. You can just Google these. A lot of copywriting frameworks essentially creates you a little bit of template. I mentioned one of those PAS, the PAS framework is another thing, as well as looking at copywriting books if you're looking at getting into some of those. And then when it comes to just video content creation, there are so many resources on the internet. If you're looking to get into that, I would highly recommend looking at just about, I mean, really, there's so many to get better at that. But again, eventually you want to start talking to people that are really good on the platform that you're trying to grow on, or people that are really good at the content form that you're trying to get. Again, that's it for this week's dose. Before you forget, if you are looking to get better content, whether it's blog, newsletter, or social media posts out for you, I highly recommend you take a look at penmo.co and be sure to use code MATT20 to get 20% off your first month on checkout. That's it, and stay tuned for next week's dose of Subscription Prescription. That's it for today. Thank you for tuning in. Please subscribe so that you can get notified when new episodes come out each week on Tuesdays.